Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm Robbie Jones, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Diana Butler Bass
Hi, Robbie.
and Kristen Dumay.
Hey, Robbie.
And our fourth partner in crime, Jamar Tisby, is not with us today, but we're wishing him well, and we'll see him next time. So here's the plan. Every episode, we take things that are on our mind, topics from the news, things from our lives, and present it to the group for discussion. We call it unscripted because we don't really know where the conversation's going, or where we're going to end up. So with that, let me just say this edition of the Convocation Unscripted is now in session. So Diane, I think we will start with you. You've been a world traveler on the road to Ireland, and had some interesting experiences getting back here. So maybe we'll just start with you.
Well, it was a really interesting trip. And in some ways, the most interesting and perhaps unwelcome part came at the very end. On my way home, got on the plane, flying out of Dublin. We had breakfast on the flight, and then people sort of settled in, watching movies, pushing their chairs back, getting ready for sleep across the long Atlantic flight. And the pilot comes on, and he said, I don't want you to be alarmed, but in a few moments,
Never good.
Never good. Never good.
in a few moments, we will be making a U-turn to return to Dublin
Yikes.
because we are losing power in one of our engines. Just going, oh no.
Goodness.
And we were approximately in the place where the Titanic went down at that point.
Mm.
And all I could think of was that you guys were going to have to get on a boat with wreaths and come out to my watery grave and toss flowers on the North Atlantic to say goodbye to me. So it was kind of worrisome. And then again, when we got back to Dublin, about 15 minutes out, the pilot comes on again and says, this is just to alert you that when we land, many of you on the left side of the plane will be seeing emergency vehicles lining the runway.
Yeah.
This is just to ensure a safe landing. I turned to the guy next to me and I said, can I be alarmed now?
Right. That sounds terrible, Diana. It sounds so
Yeah.
incredibly stressful.
Yeah, it was.
We're glad you're back and safe.
And what was the turnaround for getting another? Did you have to wait for the next morning for the next flight?
Yeah, it was a 24-hour deal where this is the best part for anyone who ever gets stuck in Europe. When we got back to Dublin, the airport manager actually got on the plane, stood up in front of us and held up a piece of paper and said, we're getting ready to pass out copies of this sheet of paper, and this is the Bill of Passenger Rights for all passengers traveling to, from, and through Europe. Anyone in a European Union airport, these are the things that are required of your airline to take care of you. And so
Wow.
United Airlines had to put us up, transport us to the hotels, take care of all of our food while we were in this waylaid period, and then get us back to promptly rebook us and get us back to the airport at the appropriate time. And it was pretty impressive, actually. There were a few little hiccups. They don't expect things like this to happen every day, so you wouldn't expect it to go 100% smoothly. But we wound up, because all the hotels in Dublin were full. It's orientation week at their big university out there. We wound up staying at United Airlines expense at a 4-star golf resort in the Irish countryside. And so it was like, oh, okay, well, here we go. We're driving through Ireland on a bus. It was like a whole nother tour. I got to know a whole bunch of new people who were on my plane and had some great conversations. And there are some pretty fabulous people in the world. And when bad stuff happens, I saw a plane full of folks sort of rise to their
Mm.
best selves. There was no screaming, yelling, meanness. No panic either.
That's really interesting that you said that, Diana, because I've been speaking a lot lately, and one of the things I just kind of found myself saying was talking about polarization and talking about these political divides and the extreme rhetoric, and just reminding people to like be grounded in real life, because online right now things are wild, right? And by design, and trying to create that reality. And I tell people, like, think about when you go to your grocery store, and if you ever need any help from somebody, or and I said even airports, right? I spend a lot of time in airports, and almost without exception, people are decent. And I know, like, you'll hear a story here or there, and those are the stories that make the news, and it makes you think that it's just a hellscape. But in reality, everybody's just fine, and if you need something, people will show up for you, regardless of where they're from, what they look like, somebody's politics. Like, if you're in a crowded room, there's going to be people who are going to help you, and most people are going to be kind, or at minimum, just let you be. And so I do worry that our conception of reality is really getting skewed. And we're talking about things like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, and how we are just not mixing these days with people in person who are not exactly like us in every way. And online spaces divide. Online spaces give a very shallow conception of humanity and of reality. And this is one of the things I want to, like, this sounds all
Mhm.
hopeful, but it's also distressing, because we are living in unprecedented times in terms of our technology, in terms of what that means for the human to human contact, which I think has always tempered extremism, or often has had that ability. So anyway, thanks for your reminder that people can be decent even under incredibly stressful circumstances, and sometimes you end up at a 4-star Irish Gulf resort.
And I tell you, the thought of plunging 36,000 feet into the Atlantic Ocean actually does bring people together rather quickly.
You made it. You pulled through. It's funny, Diana. I was actually, you shared just a little bit of your story with us on in a group chat last week, and I was just flying back in the wee hours of the morning from Atlanta, and as we were getting nearer to Grand Rapids, the pilot came on. We didn't get a "don't be alarmed," but just said, like, we're going to be encountering some really rough weather. We've tried to find a way around this. We just, I was just kind of like, oh, he's going to say that we have to divert, but no, we're going to do it. But it was I need the flight attendants to immediately take your seat. I saw a flight attendant running down the aisle, right? Everything like locked down, and then we had, like, the smoothest approach and landing. As I walked by them, I really wanted to stop and say, like, "Really? Like, what? Can you explain what just happened there?" But it was very funny. So, crisis averted. We were all very well behaved, and we all made sure that we had our seat belts on, and the flight attendants did not pick up trash, and we all got home safe and sound.
Well, Diana, before we leave the Ireland story, we've also been talking among ourselves about, you get some really interesting perspectives from across the pond. We're dealing with deep, deep divisions, as Christian was saying, that, unprecedented, really in our lifetimes for sure, kinds of divisions that we're dealing with. And you were there on, where the divisions look a little different than the ones we've been dealing with, but yet a lot of echoes of the same kinds of things. And also, I think one of the things that might be helpful for people to hear about are solutions that they were talking about, not just, the divisions, but, how they've worked on addressing some of those deep, deep divisions that also are rooted in religion, rooted in ethnicity, very similar kinds of things that we're dealing with.
I had described it before I went as a retreat, and you guys were kind of joking about that. Oh, she's going on a retreat to Ireland, which sounds like, pastoral and idyllic. But part of it was in the Irish countryside, and part of it was in Belfast. And so the first part was spent in the countryside to sort of ground ourselves in a different place, in a different landscape, and to set up some of the questions that we would be dealing with in Belfast. So it's kind of retreat slash learning experience. And then we drove out of the countryside up to the city, and there we had several interesting days of meeting people, listening to the stories of the troubles, and going to different locations that were really important in the the history of both the suffering and also in the renewal of of Northern Ireland. So it was fascinating, and we were there. We got to Belfast the morning after Charlie Kirk was murdered. So everybody in our group, which was almost all Americans, a few Canadians in the group, um, everyone in our group was just like hyper aware of what had happened at home. And we were thinking about, oh my gosh, what is this violence going to mean? And we didn't really know sort of all the detail. Well, we still all don't know the details of the story, but it was even cloudier then. And so people were feeling very frightened and on edge. And it just so happened that day, we did a sort of twofer trip. Half of the day was spent in East Belfast, which used to be the most Protestant sort of radical area of Belfast. And then we spent the rest of the day in West Belfast, which was the IRA Sinn Féin headquarters area. As a matter of fact, we drove past the party headquarters of Sinn Féin in West Belfast. And it was between these two areas, of course, that there was the greatest conflict. And these were also the two extremes of the conflict, the radical Protestant militias and the IRA. There was a whole bunch of stuff in the middle that I didn't know about, but I know about now. So here we were thinking about violence. We were thinking about division. We were thinking about what is happening at home. We were thinking about white Christian nationalism. We were thinking about all these things, and we're plunged into this urban geography of this violence that took place 30, 40, and 50 years ago. So it was very powerful for us. But the most sort of, I think, surprising moment for me, and this comes under the category of what can churches do. Um, when we got into West Belfast, we learned the history of what is called the secret peace process. And I didn't know
Mm.
this, but at a large Catholic monastery in West Belfast, two Catholic priests began to envision a process where they would talk to their Protestant neighbors. And they started reaching out to Protestant clergy primarily to try to begin to bring together friendship and see if there was any possible way that folks could hear one another's story and that there was something that the church could do to help overcome the divide that was religious and political. And and so it was just fascinating. This group of people met probably for almost 15 years and at great risk to all the participants. Some people have still kept their participation in the secret peace process secret because if their communities knew, there would still be some level of like, what? You did what? Because people literally had to sneak over barriers and physical barriers and through physical walls in order to get to places where Protestants and Catholics could gather and talk. There was no agenda. Instead, they just committed themselves to being together and talking about whatever had come up in the news or in their own lives. And so, two of the participants from that process met with us at the monastery, which is an absolutely gorgeous, amazing location and beautiful sanctuary, by the way. So we met there with them where they had met for this secret peace process. And we learned about it from a Protestant clergy person who happened to be a woman. And during the time of the peace process, she entered into the process very early on when she was only 29 years old. And she was one of only, I believe she said, five female clergy on the entire island of Ireland. Presbyterian young clergywoman. And she was invited because she knew this priest and she became part of this conversation. She did tell us that later on in her life, she stopped being a parish minister and she became a prison chaplain. And she said,
Mm.
I got to tell you, the prison was easier.
Mm.
I knew what she meant. So, but anyway, so she told the story from the Protestant side. And then there was a Catholic, actually a young man who wasn't part of the peace process, but he was kind of like the protege to one of the priests. And he wrote the biography of one of the priests. And we heard then from also how the Catholics understood this. And it was just so moving on any number of levels. But I think the primary thing that I just want to share with our listeners right now is that everybody knows about the peace process and all the famous people that were involved in it, many famous Americans, for which the Irish are enormously grateful. When they think of America, they think of the place where their relatives live, and they think of the place where that has been a safe haven for Ireland during crises, and they think about a friend who helped them make peace. Literally, people said to me, if it wasn't for America, we wouldn't have the peace that we have now.
Mm.
And when that was said in another place, I just started crying. Because it's like, oh my God, I want that America back. And so that all those things were very moving. But the fact we know about the big peace process, and there's statues to it and history books written about it and all those things. But that big peace process wouldn't be possible without the secret peace process that happened quietly and in a way that was full of risk, where people, clergy people, lay people, had to summon up the courage to overcome all of their prejudice about their enemy and people they perceived as being less than human. And they decided to sit down at tables together and talk. And that was the beginning. And that was the way that began to seed the possibility for a larger peace. Because, of course, those people went back and talked to their neighbors on either side of those walls. Those people went back and they served their congregations and they bravely started preaching differently. And they began to suggest that there was a different future for Northern Ireland rather than just violence. And one of the folks who was telling us about this process, she said that there was this moment where they looked around the room and they realized that every single person in the room, all those people who had taken those risks, every single one of them had also had someone who was very close to them murdered by the other side. And like I said, this was the day after the Charlie Kirk murder. And we're just going, oh my gosh, everybody in the room had had someone who was a personal friend or family member who had experienced exactly what we just watched on television or through the internet. So I just want to encourage people. I came home thinking, who can I talk to? Where could my secret peace process begin with all of this? And I was not the only person so inspired on that trip to think about that question. So if we, in the places where we live, all began some risky secret conversation with someone we perceive to be our enemy who was also willing to start a risky secret conversation? Would it change things?
This hits hard, Diana, because I was just having a conversation yesterday with somebody on Northern Ireland and on similarities, and they were talking about they just uh, were talking with a peace activist who had worked during this time in the troubles, and he had just said that what he's seeing in America right now reminds him a lot about what he saw there in the early 60s, right? This kind of festering division, the dehumanizing language, the escalating kind of hatred, and ripping apart this social fabric. And it's daunting, and we have a case study there of religious nationalism and what can happen, right, when people are so sure that their side is God's side.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's challenging.
Go
It's
ahead,
because I
Robbie.
mean I've been thinking about lately because I've been working on finishing my next book. I've been thinking about a different context. I've been thinking about 1930s Germany, which of course a very different set of things. And like what I'm trying to play around with is like the on the one hand, like I personally am very wary of naming polarization and division as the problem, right? Because so much about justice and what's right and what's wrong gets plowed under, right? If division itself is the problem, right?
Yes.
And so I think there's been a lot of hiding, frankly, by religious leaders who don't want to courageously take up the justice issues and who'd rather just talk about us being divided. But like, I've been like rereading Frederick Douglass, right? So if there was like a divisive person, if we just want to take, I mean, Douglas was calling people out, right?
Hmm.
And then I'm thinking about like, uh, you know, uh, I'm also wary of kind of Bonhoeffer being, the thing that's going to fix all our problems in the U.S. But I think one of the things that was notable is that um, Bonhoeffer was calling out his fellow religionists. He was being divisive, right? In fact, he
Hmm.
was refusing to show up at conferences where the Reich Church was going to be equally represented with the confessing church in Germany to kind of make this point. Like, no, 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 there's not, these are not just differences of opinion here. So like, but I think what you're saying, this other thing is valid too, right? That we've got to figure out how we can reach across the divides and mend this stuff, but we can't do that at the expense of truth and justice and what's right and what's wrong. And we can't do it in a way that I think if so I don't think I've got the solution. It's just I've been like because I feel the tug of both of these things, right? I feel the tug of it. Yes, let's reach across the divide, but then I get very, very wary very quick because I think that's the safe thing to do in a lot of ways because you just be polite, you be civil, you don't have to sort of say, actually, we think what you're doing is abhorrent. Actually, we think what you're doing is unjust. Actually, we think what you're doing is not in any way connected to the gospel or to love and we've got to be able to say that, you know, and resist. So like the how do we kind of get to this kind of right balance between resistance, speaking the truth, and also trying to pull people in, right? Not just alienating people or making it worse.
Well, I think the thing that I learned, this is sort of my, I was struggling with that too, Robbie, but it was very clear that the people who were sharing their stories with us, they weren't overcoming divides for the sake of overcoming divides.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Is that everyone
Hmm.
had a common goal, and the common goal was a peaceful home, a place where no child had to worry walking down the street, where shoppers could go and not be blown up by car bombs, where they could go to church and people wouldn't be attacked or murdered. And so there was a common desire on the far end.
Hmm.
But the problem is that all this other stuff about how to achieve that common goal was just so wrapped up in literally centuries of hatred. And so it's more than just a divide. It was literally people who had inherited almost a DNA of hating one another, who wind up being neighbors, and the hatred festers to such a point that it is destroying their
Hmm.
very possibility of having any kind of decent life at all. And they all recognized that it couldn't go on like that. And
Right.
and so it wasn't just let's get over this divide. It was like, how do we make peace? How do we become peacemakers? And that's what they saw. I think that's the thing that called all these people to the table, is ultimately they looked at that phrase of Jesus, blessed are the peacemakers. And they said, okay, we all agree on that. We all agree Jesus said that. And we all think we need peace. So how do we go about that? And I got the sense from listening to their stories that there was plenty of prophetic yelling in those
Yeah.
meetings. I don't, they were not, it was not all roses or burying things under carpets. That's why they were secret, is they had to have a room to get out exactly what they thought and felt about the people at the table.
I think this too is how we see that, we can look to models in history, but they're never a perfect fit, right? 1930s Germany, 1960s, 70s, Northern Ireland. And, as you were talking to Diana, I was thinking about where things don't like kind of fit. Map on entirely, like Robbie suggested. And I use the word polarization, and that's often a word that's used to avoid any grappling with the actual kind of source of the division. And with the reality that some people see it in their best interest to be stoking that division.
That's right.
I think too that when we think of the context also of working across these different, people need to agree on what's bad, agree on what's evil. And when you're talking about a whole bunch of people gathering in a room, each one who has lost a loved one through violence, there's a common ground about what's bad right then, right? And what worries me is I don't think we are close to reaching the point in terms of our current, quote unquote divisions, of agreeing on what is bad right now. And I just came across a study that I shared in our group chat earlier about a new little study that came out on why depolarization is hard. That tracks some of these attempts to sit down with your neighbor, sit down across difference, and the effects are minimal. That like relational change isn't cutting it right now. And now it might look different if you could get leaders, right? Leaders of kind of these movements around a table. But to do that, you need to get leaders to accept that the current state of the affairs is in fact bad,
That's
right?
correct.
And that's where I run up against the limits of this model right now for our current situation, because I'm not seeing a lot of those who are, say, on, what we might call more broadly the Christian nationalist side of one of the major divides in American Christianity right now and in American society, to say that that's a bad thing, right? And then it worries me to get to that point, to have some of those folks recognize that it's a bad thing. I'm afraid that we're going to have to go through our own version of the troubles,
Mhm.
whatever that might look like, right? So it's an inspiring model of what is possible, and then also a bit daunting in terms of where we are now and how we can get to that place of reconciliation and hope.
Yeah, I was thinking about as I've been trying to think about this polarization stuff a lot myself, and like trying to get to the root of like why I feel so skeptical about it. One of the you guys remember the movie? It's an old movie. It's this will either date me or I don't know, put me in some weird obscure spot. But old movie called The Bridge over on the River Kwai. It's got that like whistly
Yep.
little song that people whistle, and they were whistling when they were working on the bridge. And it occurred to me that that image, right? So what's going on in that movie is there's prisoners of war. They've been conscripted to build this bridge over the river, and so they're building the bridge during the day, and then at night they're making plans on how to blow it up, right? Because they're building it for the enemy, right? And it occurred to me that like if we're not careful, right, about these kind of, and we just kind of willy-nilly, let's just invite everybody to the table, let's reach as far as we can the other side, let's platform whoever we can just because they're on the other side, that will end up in a very similar thing. That like we're going to be trying to build this bridge to democracy, build this bridge to love and justice with the very people who are strapping dynamite to the piers at night, right? And it's just not going to work because every time we get three-quarters of the way across, they're going to detonate it. And so, like, trying to figure out how to be like wise about this and not be cynical, but wise about how we go and what seems worth doing and what is too far, right now. Because the thing you said, Diana, is really helpful to me is about them deciding, yeah, I have shared sense of what's wrong, a shared sense of at least a goal of peace and a goal of living together. And in some sense, that Protestants and Catholics are going to have an equal right to that life, right?
That's correct.
And that took forever for them to get to that, just that one basic agreement. And I don't think we're anywhere near that here.
Years. Yeah, and I did think about that while I was
Yeah.
sitting in several of the rooms. I thought, oh my God, we're at the beginning of the
Yeah.
troubles. I mean, that was very clear in my mind. But it also made me think of who do I want to talk to now that I don't usually talk to, who might, if I told them this story, really understand it.
Mhm.
And I think that, Robbie, some of the things you were saying is part of the reason why it was secret.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it was secret. They didn't put up an announcement on social media and say, come to a meeting where we're going to try depolarization. Literally, the two Catholic priests started sneaking over the wall and going to Protestant churches and quietly talking to clergy and just sort of showing up at worship and doing this crazy thing where they were, I mean, they're worshiping with Satan. I mean, as far as the Catholic side was concerned. And so they sort of got to know which churches would welcome them and which people would just sort of treat them horrifyingly badly. And so that sort of started giving them a sense of the Protestant landscape on the other side of the fence. And then they invited people. They invited people that they thought could participate in such a conversation and be honest. And we did learn in the discussion between the Protestant and Catholic at the monastery that along the way, again, this was not easy, any of this that they did, but there were a couple moles.
Mm-hmm.
There were people from the IRA, there were people from Protestant militias that managed to get sort of invited in by lying. But what was fascinating is the group eventually figured out who the liars were and they kicked them out, just sent them packing and said, you can't be here because you're not honest. And we want to have an honest discussion. And so that was fascinating to me, that they were really willing to, I mean, they had boundaries. You couldn't sit at the table unless you were willing to say that there was another option besides violence. And then that principle went up to the main peace process eventually in the late 90s, where if someone wanted to be part of those big peace talks that become the Good Friday Accords, um, you had to forswear political violence for your ends, and you had to decommission your militias and your armaments. And I think one of my favorite sort of moments came when somebody said that they had to decommission in order to be able to have a seat at the table and be part then of what becomes the government of Northern Ireland. And I said, well, how does that happen? And they said, well, that, like the IRA had to turn in all of its guns. And apparently, Ireland had about as many guns per capita as we have in the United States. It was a wash in guns, and mostly guns from America.
Mhm.
Um, and so the IRA had to turn in all that stuff. And I said, well, what happened to them? What happened to all the guns? And the government has never told anyone where the guns are, except for they're in a place where no one can ever touch them again. And
Intriguing.
yeah, and sort of the best guess about this, and we heard this from a couple different people who were closer into government circles, is that they took them out to a giant pit in the Irish countryside and poured concrete over them, and then planted a forest on top of the concrete pad. And I said, man, I can't wait to be that archaeologist in 1,000 years and find
Yeah.
it and say, what is this all about? But yeah, it's pretty it was there was so much there that was like, and I did ask a group of clergy. I said, as we were taught, we actually had a small clergy discussion that I led with Irish clergy. And they needed to know so much about what was happening on our side of the ocean. And then they said, but what can we do? What can we do to help you? And I said, well, you can pray for us and you can learn about what's going on and pay attention and support your American friends. I said, but the other thing is, share your story, because if there's any wisdom from your story that would help us avoid 30 years of what you went through, I know people are more than happy to receive that. And so they got to really thinking about that. Like, do we have anything in our experience that would help the trajectory that our American friends are on and help it be not as long and not as terrible as what we suffered?
Mm. Well,
So,
Diana, yeah, I mean, we're talking about the future and the past, and as at least we were talking, I would love to just let you hear while you have the floor. Maybe give us a quick thing on you were telling us before we got on about futurism, right? And talking about this history and looking ahead and what historians do versus what futurists do, and how that might help us. I think a little bit about like where we go from here. So if you could maybe like tee that up for us a little bit, I'm really curious about that.
yeah, because I'd really like to hear, as I said before we came on the air together, I'd really love to hear you guys respond to this piece. Um, the futurist is named Cassidy Steele Dale, and Robbie, I'll send you the link so you can put it in the
Great.
newsletter. And he just has a long career in doing future forecasts for mostly the United States government, which is sort of an interesting job. And it's a lot of people have talked to him, and he says it in this particular newsletter about Chris Armitage's Substack post. It's gotten a lot of play. Chris Armitage is a historian, and Armitage makes the point where every single country that has ever voted in fascism has never gotten out of it without a war. And so I remember when I read that post a few months ago, I felt like so depressed. Um, and so Cassidy Dale says it's great history. And he said everybody should read it. Everybody absolutely should read it. And he said it does the historical analysis just to a T. He said, but being a historian is a different craft than being a futurist. And then he went on and he made a couple of points about how our history, and you two just did this exact same thing very naturally, how the past does not necessarily predestine the future, and how the cases that Armitage looks like Germany, Italy, Spain, looks at Germany, Italy, Spain, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Greece, Portugal, Croatia, Romania, and Hungary. Those are the cases that or in the nobody ever gets out of it without a war category. Um, he makes the point that none of those countries had a long democratic history before they got to fascism, and that there's just a whole different set of political, social, and economic circumstances around the United States today than there were in those countries. So he thinks that Armitage's potential scenarios for the future could happen, but aren't the only ones. Armitage offers four, all of which are pretty depressing, but then Steele offers three more, and he says, given the difference in current history and the longer trajectory of the United States, he says that he thinks there are three additional possibilities. The one additional possibility is that Trump and MAGA, via their own economic and Epstein policies, and worse, alienate enough of the Republicans and independents they relied on to win in 2024 that they won't ever be able to win again without them. And so, in other words, they're just destroying any hopes for any kind of a future democratic history by seizing so much power now. So that's one thing he said could happen. He said Americans can demographically displace, this made me think of you, Robbie, can demographically displace MAGA at the ballot box. And then he goes on to try to offer some evidence for that. And then his final potential futurist scenario is the Supreme Court passes the rest of its rulings in favor of the unitary executive theory and makes an all-powerful, undeniable, untouchable presidency, and that a Democrat would win in 2028 and continue to win because the Democrats have a deeper political bench than the Republicans, and that the GOP is set to implode the day after Trump does. And then he says that he does not believe, as Voltaire said, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said it's possible to have absolute power used for good. And he says, if you don't believe me, I will show you a Barack Obama or a Raphael Warnock or a Pete Buttigieg. Or I will have you look up the mirror and I will show you you and me. And then it just kind of goes on like that. And it's a really encouraging post that ends by these three things. Any of these three things might be additional futures to the ones that Armitage suggests. And he said, any of them might succeed and all of them might fail. And that the future really becomes up to our making. And he also says this is completely dependent on the fact that we will have some sort of democratic process over the next 3 years in democratic elections. And he says that he believes that the GOP and Trump will do everything they can to try to stop that, but he does not believe they will be ultimately successful in that. And then lists a couple reasons why.
Yeah. All right, I was laughing because I was thinking like, yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want me to have absolute power. Like I don't want the me to have absolute power.
Well, I don't think I would want it either, but I think it's interesting the possibility of the idea of absolute power potentially could be harnessed for good. I mean, and he makes the point that George Washington was the closest thing we ever had to an absolute monarch in the United States, and he literally walked away from absolute power.
Yeah, I did some early research on Washington about his inaugural. You all may know that because you're real historians, unlike me who plays one on TV. But there was all this crazy stuff around his inauguration where they were wanting to fashion it after the monarchy's coronation ceremony, right? I mean, all like, so I read this crazy one where they had a plan where they were going to have a pulley system with a laurel crown that would come down on a rope onto his head as he was sitting on a throne. Like seriously, like
Do
really
not give Trump any ideas.
crazy stuff that they were dreaming up, right, for Washington. And he was like, no, we're not doing any of that stuff, right? But it was a real fight between because that's what people knew. It was this
Yeah.
monarchy and all the trappings of monarchy and kind of making that real, yeah, that real break. And the only other thing I can think of is that to say, and I'll turn over to Kristen and see what she reacts there. I think it's right. I mean, one of the things I do love about history, even as a make-believe historian, is its contingency, right? And that we are always reminded that I was just writing. I wrote a whole paragraph today um, that began with a series of sentences that began, "What would have happened if?"
Mhm.
Right? And I think we're always at that moment where we can say today, what would happen if, right? And that at least gives me some hope, even against all the powers that are aligned and look like it's sliding down the hill the wrong way. And that's all very, very real to me. There is still this part of me that thinks, yeah, yeah, but if enough of us, right, wake up, if enough of us can say, oh, wait, yeah, we don't want to end up where the troubles were. We don't want to end up in another civil war. We don't want, that's not where we want the country to end up. But we're going to have to do some stuff if we don't want it to slide that, because that's where we're headed.
Yeah, same, Robbie. I was just speaking at Candler School of Theology yesterday, and talking about some of these historical patterns. And as I'm sure will come as a surprise to no one here, it was rather bleak, my address. And so trying to, kind of salvage a little something, I kind of landed exactly where you just did, Robbie. And it's true. Although as historians, we're trained to see patterns in history, we are also always trained to think in terms of contingencies, that nothing is ever set. And like I said yesterday, history is always full of surprises, right? Something happens that nobody saw coming. And we don't know what that next big disruptive surprise could be. It could make things worse. It could make things better. It could change the terms of the conversation. And I also reminded people that right, we have agency. Really, we do. And what some of us, many of us, a powerful one of us decides to do can have enormous consequences, right? In ways that we can't even foresee. And so, as bleak as things may seem, and as bleak as we may present things on a daily basis, this is also true, right? And this is also a lesson of history. So, while I confess I did not find many of the alternative kind of realities all that compelling for that piece, Diana, I really didn't want to say that because I didn't want to crush your sense of hope. Hold on to it while you've got it. Um, but the bigger lesson, I agree with. I think that's true.
Yeah, I think that I mean historians obviously, and I think this is probably an interesting thing for folks to see it modeled, is that historians have different personalities about these things.
Mhm.
While we're trained to look for those patterns and see connections and put together those longer narrative arcs about human experience, some of us do concentrate on the surprises at the edges,
Mhm.
and that's really been sort of, I think, the thing that I've mostly looked for in my career as a writer and as a person observing culture that we live in, as well as the cultures of the past. It's like, I just love the horizons, because the most unexpected things happen there, and a lot of historians uh, just don't focus quite as much on those. You call them contingencies. I call them, I don't know, the unexpected somethings from the edges. I mean, it's from the edge. I always
Mhm.
look to the edge, and rather than just like the center problem.
Great. Well, as always, it has been, I do find some hope in just being with you all and having these conversations. So thank you, thank you, thank you for that. And thanks to all of you who are listening. And on that note, we will bring this episode of the Convocation Unscripted to a close. So, on behalf of the three of us here and the one of us who is absent, I want to thank you for tuning in, and want to encourage you to subscribe to the Convocation Substack newsletter. As well, you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, as well as all our social media channels and Blue Sky. And that'll all be in the show notes for the episode. The Convocation Unscripted is a collaborative effort between me, Robbie Jones, Diana Butler Bass, Kristen Dumay, and Jamar Tisby. And our producer for the show is Bo York, with the production services provided by Podastery. So thanks again for listening. And with that said, this episode of the Convocation Unscripted is officially adjourned, and we will see you next time.